when you work with somebody else, you bring something to it that you can't do, and you go, wow, that's interesting, that's what you're thinking, that's what I'm thinking, and you form this sort of partnership around a creative process. And that's exactly what teaching's like. It's there, you have to go there, you've got to be on your toes, which is why it's interesting. Teachers are inherently, incredibly and wonderfully idiosyncratic. I love that about teachers. So you can't make 20 teachers teach the same. Teachers are going to always flex and bend because they are human.
Welcome back to the Flourishing Podcast. I'm Danny Jaber, and I'm joined by a very special guest today who's going to provide us with some insights and guidance which will walk through best practice in classrooms and across schools. This person is a member of a band called St. Jude. They released an album back in September. They also are co-founders of Teaching WalkThrus, write a very prominent educational blog as well, teacherhead blog. They are very current and very much a part of the educational discourse online, posting on LinkedIn continually, thinking about education constantly, always engaging in conversation around education. And so it's a real honour to have on today's episode Tom Sherrington. Welcome, Tom.
Oh, thank you so much. And especially thank you for introducing me as my band, because that never happens.
Well, can I tell you, you told us about that band last year, and I gave the album a listen straight away, and I was taken back to maybe Glastonbury Festival 2011, very kind of indie feel to it. Is that the intention, or
that is the whole vibe? Absolutely. And every month I get an update from Spotify. When you have music on Spotify, it gives you an update, and
sure.
My email says something like, "Congratulations, you have had 6 monthly listeners," which is a 50% increase on last month. And you think, wow, so 6 people listened to my album.
Amazing. I'm hoping we've given you a bit of a boost today then.
Yeah, I might get up to 7 or 8.
International, even bigger. And that's awesome. And I suppose that there's so much you take away from creating something like an album and working with your friends, and just that kind of that what music does to you in a spiritual sense. Is there any crossover between good education and creating music? Is there anything you can kind of take away from that process?
I think there is. I mean, for me, I've always felt that as a teacher, the reason for being a teacher is because you have this ability to create something, a space for yourself. And even sometimes people, feel that there's stuff they don't want to do and don't need to do, but you still, whenever you're in the classroom, you have this opportunity to make the job your own. And as a teacher across a whole career, I've always felt there are lots of opportunities to invent, to create, to direct things. And it's a bit like making music. You have an idea of what you want to do. You have to then experiment a bit. Music is essentially about experimentation. So, do I like that? Do I like that? And you test things out, and then you find things that you love. And I think the same with teaching. You have to be open to experimentation, testing, working out, and then finding things that you enjoy and feel comfortable with. And every so often try something different, because that's just the same thing as a creative process. So there are definite overlaps, and there's also an aspect of collaboration. So I mean, you can make music by yourself, and I often do, but when you work with somebody else who brings something to it that you can't do, and you go, wow, that's interesting, that's what you're thinking, that's what I'm thinking, and you form this sort of partnership around a creative process. I really feel that's what the best teams are like in the schools, where you feel you're part of a thing together. And sometimes you could extend that to being the students as well. So that there are overlaps for sure.
Yeah, I appreciate the way that you managed to take my kind of very distant question there and bring that back to the crux of what we're trying to do today, and that is talk about and dive deep into education.
Yeah,
So
I could have just said, no, there's no lecture of me whatsoever.
I appreciate it a lot. And then we will dive into education. Yeah. We will talk a lot about walkthroughs today. I'm not naive to suggest to our audience that they wouldn't have heard of walkthroughs. We've been working with you now for over a year at Max, and we've made a lot of ground with not only our own WalkThrus hub, which is really closely attached to our vision for instruction, but also more recently the creation of WalkThrus coaching as a framework. And so for those teachers that might be out there, those leaders that might be out there that don't really know WalkThrus as well as maybe some of the others, how would you maybe surmise WalkThrus in the most simplistic way possible to help them understand as quickly as possible what WalkThrus is about?
Well, basically, it's a set of visual 5-step guides to common teaching practices and ideas, which serve as a sort of reference point for having discussions about what you're doing and what you might do differently. A playbook of sometimes, there's the phrase playbook is sometimes used. So there's a codification aspect, which means you write down the steps of how to do something. So that helps you agree what the thing is in the first place. So we have the same understanding of what it is. But it also then provides a kind of set of hinge points for thinking about whether or not you're doing them as well as you could, and therefore an agenda for improvement. So it informs all the discussions about what your planning is, what you're doing in the lessons, informs observing lessons, feeding back on lessons, coaching conversations. And they're visual so that they provide a way of interacting with the idea of being in a lesson when you're not in a lesson. You're sort of sitting there thinking, and the visuals prompt you to think about the scenario. There's that aspect of the visual plus the text strengthens both aspects of that. And they're very succinct. I mean, that's the other thing. They're very short, punchy summaries so that you can look at them at a glance without reading a thick book about things, which a lot of people barely have time for. And also, obviously, they serve as like colouring books and, but they're not books you read cover to cover, that you dip in.
Yes. And
then the website is a development of that. So the resource hub that you have at Max is a development of the book. So for each of the WalkThrus techniques, you've got things like a video of me explaining it and some slide decks which go into it and some resources to help you think about it. So there's a set of tools which allow you to engage with the ideas more and more deeply.
Yeah, and you've been able to go global with it. And do you think that's partly why? Because it's so easy to translate across international borders. Education's the same, right? Or
well, I think the fundamental challenges of learning are the same. So whether you're a child in England or Australia or Ghana or India or those are places I've been recently. The learning has fundamental common characteristics, and therefore problems and barriers to learning are common. And running a room of multiple students, 20, 25, 30 students in the same room, the dynamics of that are common. So, although the curriculum varies and various institutional things vary, the fundamental issues are very similar. And there are schools all over the world. So if you've got a fairly accessible toolkit, which is sort of non-specific to any particular system, you find that people find it useful wherever. So, and that's what's been happening. It's it's quite exciting. So I get to visit all these schools in different places.
Yeah, and I guess as well, education is so richly researched. I think every day you'll find there's a new paper. I read someone like Carl Hendrick, who once a month releases about 50 different summaries of different papers around education. Yeah. It's continually being whirled around. How does WalkThrus keep up with that when you've kind of got these moment in time practices that, as you say, are codified? But how do they sit with the contemporary research that's continually moving around it?
That's a good question, actually. So one of the things I've been thinking recently is, and it's not just because of the research that's changing it, it's just a contact with schools changes it, where what happens is in the training, I've come across practice which I think is better than the way I described it in the book. And so I when I'm doing the training, I say, this is really what I would say, but it doesn't quite capture that in the book. So I'm a bit more precise. And there are things like, for example, I read a really interesting study about thinking time in pair talk, and the study suggested that without the thinking time, that means one person goes first, they start talking, the other person is essentially listening to their partner give them the answers, and so they're not thinking as hard. And the study showed that those students subsequently do less well on recall tests because they didn't actually think as hard. So the idea of, should everyone have thinking time on their own before they share? Now I'm very definite that you definitely should do that, whereas in the book it sort of says you might sometimes do it or you might not, and I'm a bit vague about it. And I think, no, I'm clearer that's a good idea. Maybe at some point we'll have to do volume 2, 10 years on or something.
Yeah.
But most of the ideas are so tried and tested that they're not new or anything. So I feel like that it's rare for research to debunk anything in there completely.
Yeah.
It's a bit like, I was trying to think of a good analogy for this. It's a bit like fine-tuning the design of a car or something. So you learn more about aerodynamics or engines, and that you sort of tweak and tune, but you're not sort of saying, oh gosh, the whole design is fundamentally wrong.
Yep. Let's
begin again. And I feel like that's true with these techniques, that they're all, the way you combine them, there's enough complexity in just combining them and responding to the situation you're in. And the variation of how each individual teacher uses a technique with their class and how they interpret that, I would say, would exceed the subtlety that you might bring to the definition from a new bit of research. Yeah. So keeping them pretty static and pretty stable is probably more important than being too, bothered about the nuance of a phrase, because it's not going to make that much difference in translation to teachers who are going to vary it massively anyway.
Sure.
It's a hard challenge to get a coherent understanding in a school. So you have to do lots of discussion anyway. So in any school context, I'd advocate that people talk through the ideas, talk about what it means in their context, and adapt them. We have this whole concept called adapt, where we take an idea and make it meaningful for me and my situation. So that's always going to be the case. But you're right. I mean, there's some interesting discussions with Carl recently about, for example, I mean, I don't know if I should just go into this, but there was
You've started, Tom. Continue, please.
Well, he wrote this blog a while ago about a paper which is to do with the original study on scaffolding.
Yep.
And the origin of the word scaffolding comes from a group of researchers. I think they're called Wood et al. As a group of people, like 1978 or something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right, yeah.
And they did a study with building these towers out of wooden blocks with children being supported by their parents, I think, with different prompts to build the tower. And the idea of scaffolding, that word scaffolding, was, coined there. And I had no idea. I thought the scaffolding was like, I didn't know it had an origin as such. But then that study was redone by a group of researchers in the Netherlands, I think, and they found that it didn't reproduce. Like, some of the findings were not. So Carl was saying, well, this is pretty fundamental. The very influential study, which had originally involved 40 or something participants, has not been reproduced with 250 participants. So what does that tell us? And to me, that's saying, well, how worried am I about that? And the answer was not really, because the idea of scaffolding has subsequently developed into a much richer set of ideas, and it seems to be self-evident that scaffolds of various types are blatantly supportive of learning, like writing frames and so on. Yep. So you can see scaffolds work. And I had no idea that the origin of scaffolding was from building blocks with wood with 5-year-olds or whatever. So I'm thinking, well, if I'm scaffolding writing for 14-year-olds, that seems like a totally different domain. So even when research comes along and sometimes is confounding and disproved, you still have to say, well, okay, so what does that mean for my understanding of this concept? And actually, it might not change very much. It just makes you understand the origin of it better. So you have to consider that. If, on the other hand, if we were advocating a whole approach to doing things which was really radically disproved, you would have to think differently. So, for example, there's a whole thing about some children having like coloured overlays, and the research around that is, it's a very placebo. You can take those overlays away from children and they don't underperform; they perform the same. They feel they need them, but turns out they don't actually need them. They don't actually benefit from them. So when you put things to the test and you learn that, sometimes you have to think, well, but my whole sense of this is that those children need the covered overlays, and that can be quite shocking to someone to hear. They don't want to hear it. So none of our stuff in the WalkThrus has had anything, I would say, on that level of dubious ideas, which is at risk of debunking, hopefully.
Sure. It's simple with clarity, I think.
Yeah.
Having said that, we've got a bit of a running joke at Max that we refer to them as a bit of a babushka doll, in that you kind of get nestled in one area of the walkthroughs, and then suddenly you're clicking through or reading through that you actually need to connect it to another walkthrough, which then connects to another walkthrough.
Yeah.
Which is fine and works in principle. But what's your advice for someone new working with walkthroughs on how to navigate that sort of feeling?
Teaching is very complicated. To codify teaching is a bit of a, you could say it's a fool's errand. Why would you even try? But so, for example, to put that into some context, let's say we talk about questioning, and you've got a cold calling as an approach to questioning where everyone is asked the questions, they have some thinking time, then you select someone, and then you respond to their answers. Now, how do you respond? Well, there are different types of response. One type of response might be a process question where you say, in maths, that's the correct answer. What was your method? Talk me through, how did you work it out? Or it could be in English where someone's chosen a certain descriptor or a certain metaphor, and you say, okay, that's an interesting metaphor. So what were you thinking? What's the origin of that? So they justify their thinking. So process questions, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Probing questions, slightly different, where you're saying, but why is that then? But is it always like that? What other example could you have? But what if for this, would that be different? So you're constantly deepening.
Sure.
And process questions and probing questions are subtly different. Say it again better might be a technique where a student's giving you a sort of half-formed answer and you're thinking, yeah, that's nearly there, it's quite good, but remember to try to do this and this. Have another go, reframe that for me, and they get another go. So they're all subtly different extensions from that initial thing. And that's what it's like. So we feel like you have to sort of have level 1, level 2. Now, we could have mapped them all out in that form, but again, teaching is too non-linear. So if you start saying, start there, then do this, and underneath do that, actually, that's not actually quite how it works. It's sort of a bit more, things are running in parallel, and
you're responding, right?
Yeah,
you're
you have to sort of work out the connection you need at a certain time. But you're right, they do deepen, and they sort of, but we've done our best to organise and give people tools to do that for themselves. So we have this thing called the cluster tool where you can combine techniques and sequence them. Like, say, if you watch soccer, a game that's fluid, if you deconstructed everything that's happening, there's passing, there's tackling, there's shooting, there's dribbling, there's running off the ball, all that sort of thing. There's no neat sequence to that. It's dynamic and fluid, but you could isolate each thing and train on it.
Yeah.
So when you design a training program for soccer, you've got to be saying, well, this is a thing, let's focus on that. And then here's a thing, let's focus on that. But then the game happens, the combination is way more dynamic than you can ever pre-plan. And that's exactly what teaching's like. It's there, you have to go there, you've got to be on your toes, which is why it's interesting. But hopefully having some attempt to codify sort of makes you sort of pause in time and go, okay, let's just focus on that little dynamic there, get a better understanding of that. And then when that comes up, I'll be more ready for that. And then here, and it's sort of that subtle interplay of each technique being quite precise, but then the dynamics between them being quite fluid. So anyway, I hope that gives some sense of what we're trying to do with that.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I can hear you referring to how a teacher might develop utilising the walkthroughs and really hone their practice.
Yeah.
What advice would you have for school leaders that are, let's say you've mentioned already, clustering techniques together and are really working to embed them across the school, but are maybe at a point now where they've embedded some techniques within their school, but are perhaps now looking for the next step with those practices? Is there a point where fidelity is achieved, or is it a continual ambition that's never quite reached?
Well, I think that's it. I feel like there's an analogy we use a lot, which is the tennis player analogy. The tennis players have a common language for a set of tennis strokes, which everybody understands what they are. So, forehand, backhand, serving, volleying, everyone knows what those are. And tennis players will work on those things every single time they play, every practice, not because they're basic, but because they're core. And that's the phrase we use. They're the fundamentals of the game. And we feel that's true of a number of techniques in teaching. They're the fundamentals of the running the room. And you never quite master them because the students that you're teaching vary, and the interface of the curriculum and the students is so variable. And it doesn't necessarily go in a neat flow with your career stage. So, for example, in my own experience, in some ways I went backwards. Like my easiest teaching, or what I felt was like almost most comfortable teaching, was right at the beginning of my career, where I was teaching in, the last 2 years of secondary school, pre-university, A-level physics, and I'd just done a degree in physics. I thought, they were compliant, and behaviour management was straightforward. I was kind of flying straight away. I found it relatively easy. I then went to work in secondary schools in London, got absolutely
more challenging,
murdered. and actually in my last year of teaching, even though I'd been teaching a long time, I taught a lower set in maths, grade 10. It's the hardest teaching I ever did. It was just confounding, Why do they still say 2 cubed is 6, even though I've explained it 100 times, and this, how far back do I need to go to explain this? And it turns out a long way back. And all of that was just really tough, difficult, and behaviour was hard. So behaviour management you always had to be so on it. So I feel like it's a mistake to associate development through techniques to do with length of service. It's all about context, where I'm at, what challenges do I have, and sometimes the fundamental techniques are the most useful. Having said that, there are lots of things which are additional. In the walkthroughs, we do include all sorts of interesting approaches to teaching, like, for example, instructional inputs is a thing I used to love using as a teacher, where the students get a chance to teach the class something. And I feel like over the course of a year, you've got, say, 24, 30 students in a class, you've got, say, 10 groups of 3. And so on 10 occasions across the year, you've got students who come to class and explain a concept. And it could be they do a class demonstration in a science lesson. They might run a practical. They might literally organise the class, tell them how to do it. They might set them homework, all that. And they used to love it. They used to love it. And I used to love it. So this week we've got Michael, Annie and Stephen. They're going to be telling us about the Ray box experiment. So guys, over to you. And these guys would run the lesson. They'd have slides. They would say, okay, what you need to do is, here's the apparatus. They would run the lesson. And then they would say, like, here's some questions. Here's the home. And they would have planned that whole thing. And it was brilliant. But they really had to do it properly. The standards were high. I get quite cross with them if they hadn't planned it. They guys, this is your lesson. You've got to just rock up and not do it. And so they understood it. It was serious. It wasn't like a gimmicky thing. So every single student in my classes used to have the experience of running a lesson, or more than one. And that instructional inputs thing is developing their organisation, their understanding of the content. And of course I'm there as well, so the students in the rest of the class are still getting a similar experience. And that mode B concept is, as well as, like, most of the lessons are me, instructional teaching, being the leader, but we switch it up for sometimes the students do it. Then you've got the curriculum diet, which is way more interesting and rich, and I would say superior to just the teacher only ever being the one that leads.
Yeah. You lean in a little bit to what we're looking to achieve as a system, and we are looking at an assessment position paper which takes into consideration short, medium and long cycle assessment. And I think you're leaning in there nicely to the value of medium and long cycle assessment. If we were to zoom into short cycle assessment, where we're looking at that responsiveness to what's going on in a single lesson, or adapting to the understanding of your students, what's a check for understanding that you would suggest is your kind of go-to, that's very easy, simplistic and achieves its purpose?
Well, the most obvious one to me is show me boards, because then it's the most direct way of doing the thing of having loops. So as a concept I'm really optimistic about taking off, which is formative action loops. It's something I've written about quite a lot recently. It's working with a group of people called Toots Revolutie, who are from the Netherlands. And they sort of reframed formative assessment to call it formative action. And the heart of it is formative action loops, where basically you set up students to do a task which reveals their understanding to you. After instruction, you say, let's see if you can do this thing. And then they have to reveal that to you. And then show me boards would be one way of doing it. You might say, okay, can everybody do this maths problem? Or can everyone write a sentence of this type or whatever you're showing? 3, 2, 1, show me. And then you look at the information and then you analyze it. You work out, you interpret what's happening. Okay, what's that telling me? And then you decide what to do about it. So the whole point of that is, right, so what does that tell me? That tells me that not everybody knows how to do it. Some do, some don't. So then I have to sort of interrogate that. So I have to then decide the action. The action is going to be, we're going to have to reteach because too many of them didn't know it. So I'm going to reteach that whole idea, go through another example. And then I have to verify that that's succeeded. So I don't just go, so does everybody get that now? Yeah. I have to check, I have to verify. So what I do is I now do another round. So show me boards again. Here's another question, a bit like the last one. Now how are we doing? Second loop. Okay, right now. Okay, hopefully you had a better success rate than the first time because you've retaught it. And that's the kind of thing. So the whole point of these formative assessment or formative action processes is that you act on the information that it's telling you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to do it straight away because there's too many misconceptions, too many issues, and you have to deal with it now. Sometimes you just notice that after a couple of loops, say, James still doesn't get it. Okay, so are you going to just make the whole rest of the class wait around while James works out what's happening? Maybe not, but you're sort of parking. Okay, I've noticed that about James, so I'm going to have to defer that, but I'm going to deal with that separately. So you have to make judgments about whether you reteach in the moment, defer it to another time, or just move on and go, wow, that's good, consolidate your numeric, we're all ready to go. But so that's a kind of classic example. So Show Me Boards is brilliant for that because it's quite quick. But there are other forms like guided practice things where you circulate, where you do quick circulating and checking. One of the walkthroughs that I'm a big fan of is called short feedback loops, where the tasks are very punchy, so that you just say, right, here's the thing, can everyone do this thing? Like it'll be a type of sentence. And you might circulate and check very quickly around the class. Work out a rough idea of the success rate and whether or not, which bits to reteach. Okay, some of you are still doing this, so let's make sure we're not. So here's another go, try this one, get this bit right. And you sort of really on the case with details. And that's just one type of teaching, obviously. So, but it's either circulating actively or show me boards are really the only two ways to see how every single individual is doing. And when you see teachers who don't do either of those things, you think, well, how else do you do this?
Yeah.
So you're not using show me boards, so you can't see, and you're stuck behind your console looking into the room.
And I should point out to our audience that on CEVN, if you are part of our Max audience, we do have some learning modules that exist to help us understand the explicit instruction sequence more, checks for understanding as well, and some of what Tom's been talking about in terms of how we might utilize them. So if you want to give yourself a bit of extra reading and learning, those modules are online on CEVN. Tom, we'll move on to the last segment of our podcast now. We've asked for some questions from within our system, some of our teachers, leaders and system staff, and so I thought I'd relay some of them just to see if we can give them some answers to.
Are they like, what's your favourite colour, that sort of thing?
Yes, the first one is, why yellow for the... No. So the first one, it connects nicely to a little bit what you're talking about there about student agency, I think, and part of that being that we have our vision for instruction, but we also have our vision for engagement, which looks at elevating respectful behaviour from our students and teaching that behaviour as much as anything as well. One of our leaders suggested that naturally there's quite a fine line between teaching and learning and helping our students grow and flourish as human beings. And something like a walkthrough is a very simplistic process when you've got some really complex individuals sat in front of you. Do you see that there's any wariness that we need to be kind of considerate of when it comes to, as I say, the simplisticness of the walkthroughs themselves and the complexity of the humans that sit before us?
No.
Short answer.
No, because here's my view of this. Like, with a walkthrough, you're trying to sort of wrestle complexity into something you can discuss meaningfully. A bit like the football analogy again. I mean, if you don't understand rules, I'm like tonight, I'm
a Richmond fan for my sins.
Okay, I am going to watch Aussie rules football for the first time in my life. I have no idea how it's played. I've watched it on TV, it made no sense to me whatsoever. So when I watch it, it's sort of slightly chaotic looking. But someone could explain to me, well, there are phases of the game, or break it down. And then I might look at it and go, it doesn't look like that to me. But of course, you have to have an attempt to say, well, this is what happens and that's happened. And the reality is way more complex. So that's what we're saying. We're saying, of course, it's more complex. That's not a surprise. But if we just say, oh, it's so complex, we can't talk about it. Oh, it all depends. It all depends on this. It all depends on that. And sometimes kids do that. And sometimes they do this. And we just don't get anywhere. So the walkthroughs is an attempt to say, let's sort of artificially codify and say this, then this, then this, then this. But of course, naturally, complexity follows. So one of the things that sometimes gets levelled at me is, are we trying to make things too rigid? And I just think, are you kidding? Even if I wanted to make it rigid and say, everybody must do this, it's almost impossible to make teachers be rigid. They're inherently dynamic. There's inherent variation, chaos, flux, change, individuality. Teachers are inherently, incredibly and wonderfully idiosyncratic. And I love that about teachers. So you can't make 20 teachers teach the same. That's never going to be possible. So what you're trying to say is, within that inherent variation, let's have some kind of sense of a similar understanding of an idea, like how do I check for understanding, so that we have some broadly successful approaches. But you're not looking for everyone to be identical. You're just trying to say, let's at least be able to have meaningful conversations about what we're trying to achieve, because we're all trying to achieve similar things in the learning. But teachers are going to always flex and bend because they're human. Yeah.
Okay, you've used sporting analogies a couple of times then, so let's step outside the classroom for a moment. One of the questions that were sent in was to do with practical lessons. So, practical lessons involve equipment, there's safety, there's new concepts, more active and practical concepts that are being learned as well. What strategies would you recommend that are safe in that sort of learning environment, but also manage cognitive load? So we're talking about a multitude of different things that are having to be combined there, as well as the teaching and learning, so that students can continue focusing on what it is they need to be learning about.
Well, there's lots of things. I mean, I could design a whole flow for a practical subject. There are things like success criteria, so knowing what excellence looks like in the context of, say, sport or performing arts or anything practical, so that you have to then sort of often compare. Here's an excellent example, here's a less excellent example. There's that. There's things that we're breaking things down into small steps. So sequencing things, what are the first steps? So how do I take a movement or a physical activity and turn it into learnable chunks? But I suppose the common one I recommend is one called rehearsal and performance. Because I feel like in a lot of things like sport, in music, lots of arts, performing arts, there's this need to practice things and then step to deliver. So you have to have this sort of low stakes rehearsal mode where we learn to do things, try things out, and then deliver a throw of the discus, or deliver the high stakes performance in a sport or the performance in drama. That's not the same as the learning process. So rehearse and then perform. So that's a good walkthrough.
Well, we'll move on to the last segment now, and that is that you have inspired me as a teacher, and Danny has also inspired me as a teacher. I've got 30 minutes spare next week where I'm not teaching. I've got 30 minutes at the end of the day. I know I haven't got any meetings. What advice do you have for me? Where shall I start? What shall I do? What shall I use those 30 minutes for?
That's a really good question. Well, it depends on what you're interested in. I think one of the things that teachers often don't have time for is planning a learning sequence really thoroughly by thinking about what the learning experience would be like. So how will I explain that? What resources will I have? So to sort of get off the autopilot and really think hard about a particular teaching sequence. So what's the bigger frame? How do I frame the big picture? in terms of where we are on the learning, therefore what do they need to learn, and make sure it's well resourced, prepare scaffolds so for children who might need support. Misconceptions, rehearse explanations, and have all of that really ready, because I feel like half an hour, the best thing you can do is sort of plan. Ideally, that would be with someone else who's also teaching that. So you're collaboratively planning. So we talk through explanations, we rehearse them, we talk through learning sequences. We rehearse, say, the flow of ideas. So where do we start? What comes next? Like, for example, if you're a maths teacher, it would be like the flow of examples. Or if you're an English teacher, how you build from simple ideas into a bigger flow of writing or whatever. So I feel like that would be a good use of time. Another one would be to just give yourself time to do some reading and read a research paper, read one of the multiple books out there, but to always be thinking what you'll use that for. I mean, there is time for just reading for general interest, but I feel like if time is limited, just finally do read the chapter in Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School, which is called Why Do Students Forget Everything I Say? If you read that, I would say it was like half an hour, incredibly well spent. You'll learn a lot. It'll make you think really hard about your practice. And if you're always the one who can't raise a hand when someone says, have you read Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? I'd say, well, do that, because that's going to help you a lot. And it makes you think really hard about learning and memory. And often teachers just don't have time for that. So if you've got half an hour spare, read a chapter of a classic book like that.
Amazing. That's an amazing bit of advice. Last question then, Tom, and you've naturally led into it, as you have done with much of this interview so far. Is there a book or a person that's inspiring you right now?
Wow, that's a really good question. There are a few people I think of in that regard. I think someone who there's a couple of people who I encounter who are really hot on the kind of coaching side of things, and I love their approach. There's Adam Colbeck and Sarah Cottinghatt, and they do this fantastic Substack which links to a set of videos which are called Coaching Cuts. I think they've done up to about 40 now. And normally it's Adam coaching someone in his context, and then Sarah kind of like analyses what he's doing. And so you get a bit of a video of someone coaching somebody, and they discuss the move he's making and the reason he's coaching in that way. Amazing. So that to me is just, I love this whole thing of the honesty, like it's literally a real video of him actually coaching, and then she kind of analyses it. It's just superb. It's just very honest, very open. And I find that kind of thing very inspiring. So that's just one recent example.
Incredible, yeah. Talks to the small circles of education, because when I first came out of university, I decided to do a year as a teaching assistant in a school in London, and I was Sarah Cottinghatt's teaching assistant for one of her English classes.
No way.
Back in that day, so a little while ago. Hello, Sarah, if you are watching this.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
The small circles that we all exist within, I suppose. So yeah, nice. Good.
But generally, I'm inspired by, I'll tell you one other sort of type of inspiration. So, for example, there's a school in Wiltshire in England called St Michael's of Aldbourne. Aldbourne is the village it's in. And the head teacher there called Jude. And she's actually now writing with us. She's co-writing the next WalkThrus book, which is for early years and key stage, so like 3 to 7, early years and key stage 1, and we say in England. And she runs a primary school, which is fantastic. And so she really walks the talk, and their professional culture there is exceptional. So you have lots of teachers who, they talk in forensic detail about the way they plan, they observe each other, they're very open with each other. And she brings in these superb ideas into her practice. And so for me, seeing somebody who's so enthusiastic and so humble about it as well, modelling excellence in a school with all these great ideas and creating a great professional culture, that's very inspiring. And then obviously looking forward to the book that she's writing. So you heard it here first, that there's going to be an early years book. And so all the stuff about play and early vocabulary development, all this sort of stuff is so important. And so that book's under construction right now. And we are invited her to do it because you see it and you go, wow, this is amazing. There's lots of other people who know about primary education, but to see someone delivering it and go, right, okay, no, you're in it. Right, can you write about it? So that's another type of
incredible
source of inspiration, specific individuals. I could name quite a few people, but Jude is amazing.
Thank you so much. And a bit of exclusive news there on the Flourishing Podcast, something to look forward to. But Tom, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. We really appreciate all that you're doing and continue to do with Max. And we know you're coming back out here later in the year. And I'm sure you'll be back out again in 2027 onwards as well. So you've done so much for education internationally, and you're doing so much for our own system here within Australia, within Victoria, and for our Catholic schools. So we are really, really appreciative for all the impact that you're having with us.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I love working with Max. The whole spirit of the place is amazing. So thank you for inviting me.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please do give us a thumbs up. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. We have set up an email so that you can write into us if you've got any questions, if you have any desires for future guests, if you'd like to know more and if we can find out more information that's going to support wherever it is you're at with you and your school, please write into us. It's podcast@max.vic.edu.au. We'll put it in the description. We'll put a link to the Kevin page I referenced early on in the description as well. And maybe we'll put a link to Tom's album in there as well, and we'll give him a few more listens, international listeners anyway. So until next time, keep flourishing.